Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So hello engagers. Today we have another special guest. Today we have Scott. But Scott, before we kick off, before we talk about your introduction and everything awesome, are you prepared to engage?
Scott Crabtree is my name. Engagement is my game.
Let's do this. Scott
totally
Crabtree.
Cheesy, but I couldn't resist. Sorry.
Fantastic, because you're the one who helps people apply science to thrive at work. Because after earning a degree in cognitive science from Vassar? How's that pronounced?
Vassar.
So yeah. Vassar College, he went on to lead the design and development of video games and other software. And he discovered the science of thriving, which is positive psychology and other brain sciences, in 2003 and became immediately passionate as a student and a teacher of such a research. He resigned his senior leadership position in Intel in 2011 to found Happy Brain Science. And he has had clients like DreamWorks, Nike, Kaiser-Permanente, Boeing, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, Blizzard Entertainment, and NBC. And of course, he continues to use his game design development background to, of course, gamify all of his keynotes and workshops. And he's also produced the successful serious card game, Choose Happiness at Work. And of course, he applies the latest findings from adult learning and hears from audience members years later saying that they still remember and apply immediately applicable techniques learned in these workshops. Is there anything that we're missing from that intro, Scott?
That is more than enough. Thank you for that kind introduction.
So, Scott, we always like to get to know our guests as much as we can. So we'd like to know, what does it feel like to be Scott in a day like today, yesterday, past week? What do you do? What does it look like? What is your, usual things that is happening in your life?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Game. I think I'm a lot like you and some of the great guests that you've had in that I have a lot of variety in my work days and work weeks. So it's easier for me to describe a week than a day because there is no typical day, as is true for a lot of us. So in a typical week, I might have a workshop or two. I might have a half-day workshop somewhere that I'm traveling to, whether that's Google in California, or recently I was in the northernmost town in the United States at the northern tip of Alaska to give a workshop. So I travel all over to give workshops. Those workshops are typically about the science of happiness or employee engagement, including a gamified look at employee engagement. How do video games and other games engage us so well, and how can leaders learn from game designers? So in a typical week, one or so day of my week will be traveling and presenting, doing a keynote or a workshop for an organization or a conference. And then another day of the week, I might have 3 or 4 executive coaching clients. So I do both individual and group coaching to help people apply science to thrive at work. And then I do some writing, blogging. I've got a book coming out soon called All Work and Some Play, the scientific case for playing games at work. And then I support the sale of my card game, Choose Happiness at Work. And I'm sometimes out facilitating either gameplay sessions or facilitated discussions that use the same cards. And finally, my weeks are rounded out by managing some of the employees and contractors that I have the good fortune to partner with. So lots of variety, and I try to be as playful as possible through all of it, and some days I'm more successful than others, but I am a lucky man blessed with a lot of variety.
That sounds fantastic, Scott, and that sounds very exciting as well. There's many things that you're doing, many things that are of our direct and absolute interest, and that's what we're here to talk about. And the first question we always like when we start strong, so to speak, now we get to know you a bit better, and now we want to get to know a bit better as well what your work is. And that is where we get to our first question, and it's for you to tell us a story of what you would like to call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning. And of course, when creating maybe your game, maybe a gamified workshop, one of these related things that were maybe even in the science of happiness, that, of course, usually these things are the ones that set us up either for future success or turning it around entirely and having something, much better than you initially expected. We want to be there with you and suck all of that learning into ourselves as well.
Yeah, so many failures to choose from, Professor Game. It's hard to pick just one, but I will go with Choose Happiness at Work, my card game. I come from a video game design and development background. I wanted to make a game that taught the science of happiness that I fell in love with. And perhaps like a lot of game designers, my first attempts were too complex. I had lots of rules, and I said, okay, when you start this game, you can be a startup, a mid-sized company, a large company, or a Fortune 500 company. And if you do that, you'll start with different levels of resources and different numbers of challenges. And then you've got to complete these challenges in these different directions and get all these things taken care of in order to be successful. And it just became way too complex. And I spent months trying to refine that game, play test that game, get input from people. And it wasn't like it was a disaster, but it also wasn't like it was going super well. So I kind of flailed around for a few months, to be honest, over-designing the game, making the game too complex. And then I was driving back from a workshop. I think it was a workshop I was doing for a game company up in Seattle. But I was driving back from a workshop and I was like, wait a minute, what if I just get rid of almost all the rules? What if this game simply drafts off of great games like Apples to Apples and Dare I Bring Up Cards Against Humanity? What if the play mechanic is simply people sitting around a table and matching up from two decks of cards? And what if one of the decks was just problems at work and the other was just solutions, but we didn't have these different challenges and quests and size companies and resources and all of that? What if it were just one person picks a problem, everyone else tries to solve it, then the person who is the judge picks best solution for 2 points and most creative or funny for 1 point, and that role rotates around the table. And everything just went into a simpler, more fun, more engaging game. So the lesson I learned is, I'm sure one that many of our listeners have learned: sometimes we try too hard to make something great, and sometimes stripping things away and simplifying is actually the path to greatness.
It's funny that's exactly your learning, because after 100 and many episodes by now, there have been like times in which, there is this trend of people talking about this, people talking about that, people talking about, starting simple, and there's people talking about this. And right now the trend is literally simplifying. Going from something with a lot of rules, with a lot of things, and stripping it down to the most basic thing, and maybe taking it from there, or maybe even just leaving it there, is probably going to work. And I would say it probably goes back to the origins. Like, what is it that you want to achieve with your card game? And that's probably what, in the middle of creating all of these mechanics, all of these things, it happens to the best of us. You could have created 20 games before, and all of a sudden you created this card game, which was, I'm not sure if that was the first time for you creating a card game. And then you got so excited about all the things you could do, and, it kind of got out of control in a way. I don't know if that was your experience.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This was my first card game. I had done mostly video games before, and I love games, and some of the games that I love are complex, so it's natural to think, I want to do more and more and more. But I think that trend is there for a reason. The world is very complex these days, right? But it doesn't have to be, especially if you're connecting people to each other, which the science of happiness says is a core source of well-being for all of us, is the quality of our relationships. In my card game, I'm trying to get people sitting around a table talking to each other. People sitting around a table talking to each other, that by itself is extraordinarily complex in some ways. So you don't need a whole lot of complexity on top of that to get great interactions and learning. You just want to provide enough of a catalyst, enough of a structure to facilitate those conversations. But human conversation is plenty complex already. If we can get people to talk to each other, I think a game has done quite a bit already.
Absolutely. So Cards Against Humanity seems to have even been one of your main inspirations for that simplification.
Well, my friend says that my game should be called Cards for Humanity, because it's trying to teach the science of happiness at work. I'm not particularly proud of referencing a game that has a tagline, a party game for horrible people. But yes, that and Apples to Apples and other simple family-oriented games. Not that Cards Against Humanity is family-oriented in any way, shape, or form, but other family games
hopefully.
like that have been inspirations, yes.
Definitely. And spinning this on its head and making it a 180-degree spin, what would you say is, again, a story of something that you set out to create something, and of course it was a success, whatever your term for success could be in that case. Once again, we want to live that story with you like we did this time, and we want to be there and understand what would you assign, what the key success factors could have been in such a development.
Well, it's interesting because, again, the theme here is simplicity. So I wanted to bring more of my game background and gamification into my speaking work. So I started off speaking about the science of happiness because I fell in love with it. I didn't know that there was a science of happiness until I read Sonia Lyubomirsky's great book, The How of Happiness. She's a University of California professor, and her book introduced me to the fact that there was a science of happiness. And so I started speaking about this, and to my surprise, it turned into a new career where I was quitting Intel and founding Happy Brain Science. So after a year or two went by, I was like, I need to bring games and gamification into this. This is who I am. I've been a game designer and player and lover of games and gamification most of my life. And so I started looking at various frameworks out there and gamification approaches out there. And look, there are lots of wonderful approaches. You've had multiple guests on your show who have wonderful frameworks. For me, the success really came when, again, I simplified the approach based on a book that I love called Glued to Games by Rigby and Ryan. Glued to Games, as you may know, takes a self-determination theory look at games and motivation. So essentially that framework, oversimplified for the sake of time, says that we human beings have core intrinsic needs that we are highly motivated to satisfy it at pretty much any time. And those needs are autonomy, relatedness, and mastery. So this was popularized in Daniel Pink's book, Drive. He turned relatedness into purpose, but similar roots of self-determination theory. So I was looking again at various complex frameworks, complex ways of approaching gamification, but most of my audiences and clients, they're not game developers, right? So if I come at them with a complex framework and lots of things you can do with points and badges and levels and leaderboards and all this stuff, they very quickly get overwhelmed. I'm not saying any of that is wrong, but for my world, for my clients, for my audiences, and for myself, I wanted to boil it down to its core as much as possible. So I loved the autonomy, relatedness, and mastery framework in Glued to Games, self-determination theory. And while they don't value it much, I think surprise is a big element of games. You know, the neuroscience is clear. When our expectations are exceeded, very loosely speaking for the sake of time, our brains flood with dopamine and say, whatever this was, let's do this again. So that autonomy, relatedness, mastery plus surprise equals ARMS. And so I developed a session that was my first game in a speaking session. So the speaking session teaches about gamification, and the session is a game. I give out points. Those points are good for prizes at the end of the session. And that has just been enormously fun, satisfying work to bring my speaking and employee engagement work together with my game background into a gamified session. Super fun for me to give, and the feedback has been wonderful from that.
That sounds fantastic because, I mean, you're integrating many of these principles that you've been mentioning and many of the things that you've been talking about. It's not just about talking the talk, but also about walking the talk. And there you did exactly that. I mean, you were talking about your experience, your life before, getting into the Happy Brain Science and realizing that you're also a game creator and getting back to those roots and doing these things. And what would you say there's something there that you would say like, oh, thank God I did this because that's what, I mean, maybe not a single thing, of course, because there's usually a bunch of things that we do to get to wherever we are. But what would be something that you feel was very well weighted in that sense for the success?
Great question. The first thing that comes to mind for me, Professor Game, are these little foam brains that I got. So when you go to a trade show, everybody's got swag, everyone's got little giveaways, right? And they're usually, they vary in quality and desirability. Let's just put it that way. So, we were going to go to some trade shows, and we found these foam brains that are roughly the size of a small orange, and they look a little bit like a small orange because that's our brand color, but they're a brain, and they just say Happy Brain Science and subdue stress and choose happiness at our site, happybrainscience.com. The point I'm getting to is that I decided to give away points in the workshop by giving away these foam brains. So what happens is I tell people when they've earned a point, and then I pick up one of these foam brains, and I'm tossing it around the room. Throwing things around a room that can't hurt people. I have spilled people's beverages, full disclosure, but it's almost impossible for me to hurt someone because it's basically a foam stress ball. So when I get a great answer or question from someone and I'm like, that's a great point for you, I throw them a brain. There's something about throwing essentially balls around a room that just lightens up a room and gets everyone into the right spirit. So I can tell them, hey, we're going to play a game. You can track your points. Those points can help you get prizes at the end. All of that helps people loosen up and feel like it's a game. But to me, nothing helps as much as throwing things around the room. So throwing foam brains as points around the room immediately just brings a physical element. Invariably, I have a bad throw, it hits somebody in the arm, or somebody goes to catch it, it bounces off their hand and hits their neighbor in the head. And it's funny and light and brings some energy in the way that points are awarded in that session.
It sounds fantastic. So throwing brains around in a conference would be your best practice in this case.
As long as we clarify that they're foam brains, yes, I will own that.
For sure. So Scott, what would you say? I mean, we've heard about these two successes that you've had, because in the end, even the failure ended up being a massive success, which is exactly what we were looking for. When you're creating these experiences, do you have some sort of mental process? Do you have some sort of framework? I know you mentioned the arms, I think it was.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know if that's what you would like to talk about, but we would like to, get into your brains sort of a little bit and see how do you create these things in, 3-4 minutes or so. So can you tell us, what does that look like?
Absolutely. So let me tell you what happens when I approach a new workshop, because I think that informs a lot of the different work I do.
Absolutely.
So first and foremost, I'm looking for a problem that people want to solve. Science says we have a negativity bias, which is great for survival, not so great for thriving in life. But what that means is that we pay more attention to problems than successes. Bad comments hurt more than nice comments help. There's lots of examples of how bad is stronger than good, as a peer-reviewed academic paper puts it. So that means I'm looking for a problem people have that I can solve. Might be that employees are unhappy at work. It might be that employees are disengaged at work. It might be that they're struggling with change. But I'm looking for what's the problem, and then I'm looking for solid science that can help me solve that problem. I try to ground everything I do in science as much as possible because I trust the scientific process more than I trust anybody's opinion, including my own. I used to work at Intel, as you mentioned, for 6+ years. The former CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, used to say, everyone has an opinion, some people have data. So I was honed, so to speak, at Intel to really focus on the data, focus on the science. What do the numbers say? What do the studies say? So I identify a problem. I search in science for solutions. I read a lot of books, go to conferences, watch TED Talks, et cetera, et cetera. And that science is wonderful, but typically the average scientist is not the best speaker or communicator. They're unbelievably smart, orders of magnitude smarter than I will ever be, but they produce stuff that is inaccessible for too many people. So I try to take all that science and distill it down into forms that people can immediately apply. Whenever I'm talking with clients, I say, what do you want? My most important question for clients is always, after we're done working together, what do you want people to think, feel, or do differently? And inevitably what they say, they get specific about their needs, but they always say, we want things that people can apply right away. then I'm looking at all that science that I've learned. I'm trying to distill it down into 3 themes because the brain can usually hold on to 3 themes in a framework. Maybe 4, as I had in the ARMS framework, autonomy, relatedness, mastery. Surprise, that's 4. A lot of frameworks are 3, but I'm looking for 3 or 4 key ideas. Most of us try to teach too much at once, so I try to distill it down. If I could only tell you 3 or 4 things, what would the most important things be? And I organize a workshop or a session around those 3 or 4 points. And then, as you and your listeners know better than the average person, we don't learn very well by just listening to some person talk, right? So I try to think, okay, I want to teach them these 3 or 4 things. What do they need to do to learn those things? Is it playing this game? Is it doing this exercise? Is it collaborating with table mates to produce a poster? What action are they going to take in this session to learn one of those 3 points? And then what do I need to teach them so they're ready to take that action? So I kind of work backwards in a way once I'm in the heart of the session. I work backwards from what activities do I want them to do? Then what do they need to know before they're ready to do that activity? And that process essentially produces a session that has an introduction of problem, source of solution, which is science, overview of what that science says, explore that science in 3 themes with lots of interaction and hopefully playfulness, and then wrap it up with summary, action planning, and commitments to follow through.
That makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much for that framework, Scott.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Scott, we would also like to know, I kind of think there is a theme here, and maybe I can kind of predict what you might say here, but of course I would like to know what you think is, and I would like to know if you have some sort of, I used to call it best practice, and it sometimes is well interpreted, but you can also think of it not as a silver bullet, but the nearest thing, so to speak. Like something that if you think about this or strategize in this or that way, probably most gamification or, game-based projects or any of these sorts of things might benefit from at least.
So what can most gamification projects benefit from?
Like, I don't know, it could be, if you think about throwing the stone into the water, it usually, it's going to produce these waves. So if you want to produce waves, throwing stone into the water would be a best practice. That kind of general, very general idea.
Yeah, to me, it's more than anything else, it's about feedback and iteration. So couple of inspirations here. One is a wonderful quote, and I have to apologize to whoever came up with this quote because I'm not remembering the person who first said this, but the quote is, writing a novel is like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. I think that's very applicable to making a game or a gamified workshop or gamifying a learning initiative. So many of us get overwhelmed and we get lost in our own heads and we don't take action. We start overthinking things. To an extent, that's what I did when I first approached Choose Happiness at Work. I was overthinking it and not just taking action and then getting feedback. So we need to take steps and not just theorize in our own heads. And then after every step, if possible, we want to get feedback. So if I'm not careful, the mistake I make is I start to fall in love with my own ideas or game or whatever, and I start to think about it and work on it too much on my own. And most game developers know this. You've got to do user testing and lots of it to figure out what's actually working and what's not working as well as you think. So there's a great inspiration for me, which is a Harvard Business Review article, How to Stay Stuck in the Wrong Career. The author says when we want to make a major change in our career, what we tend to do is we try to come up with the perfect plan and then execute that plan. And that almost never works because we never have enough information about a new career to come up with a perfect plan. So same thing here. If you're making a new game or gamified learning experience or gamified workshop, it's tempting to try to come up with the perfect plan and then execute that plan. But unless you're doing something frankly boring, like a minor iteration on a previous work, you're not going to create great things without taking some big new risks. And if you're taking some big new risks, you're going to need a lot of feedback on what's working and not working. So that's a long-winded way of saying, don't get lost in your head. Take some action. Even if you can only see the next step, take the next step and then test it and get feedback. And that iterative process ultimately helps you produce great interactive gamified learning experiences.
So the god of internet says that quote is by E.L. Doctorow or something like that.
Yes, thank you.
How to
That's
pronounce
right.
it. And there is the Martin Luther King quote, which is very similar. And it says that you don't have to see the full, staircase to take the next step.
Oh, I haven't heard that one. Excellent. Yeah, great. Thank you for reinforcing and extending my quotes that inspire me not to get into analysis paralysis.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense, and I think we've talked about this before. I mentioned that it once was a trend as well among guests about starting simple and starting small. I think starting small means taking that first step and doing something
Absolutely.
and testing something. So that makes a huge amount of sense. And the next question I would like to ask Mr. Scott Crabtree is, who would you like to, of course, after, listening to the questions, I know you've heard a couple of interviews before as well. Is there anybody that comes to your mind, somebody that you would like to listen to, answering these questions in Professor Game?
You've had some amazing guests already. So you've had some of my heroes already. Jesse Schell's at the top of my list. I was delighted to listen to that episode. I don't believe, unless I missed it, that you've had a gamification expert that I really adore. His name is Tyagi. That's spelled Thiagi. And he mercifully encourages us to use Tyagi because his full name is a very long Indian name that is very hard for me and others to remember. I'm embarrassed that that's true, but it is true. So Tyagi takes, his theme is improving performance playfully. So he and I are focused on similar things. How can we help organizations get the best from their brains through a playful approach? What games can we bring to organizations that can connect people and break down some of the silos and build better teamwork and help people learn about each other and how to be successful through a playful approach? So Tyagi is great, puts out great newsletter with lots of cool exercises you can use in workshops and other gamified approaches to learning. I highly recommend his work and would love to hear you and him have a great conversation with each other.
We hopefully will. In that same sense of recommendations, you've spoken already about a couple of books. But what would you say is a book that you would recommend to an audience like this one, like The Engagers? And of course, why would you recommend that book?
Well, I have already talked about it, but really I can't say enough about Glued to Games by Rigby and Ryan. So there's a bit of a quick funny story behind this. I was, as you mentioned, I've been blessed with having Activision and Blizzard, both halves of that company, as repeat clients. So I was at Blizzard and giving a session about an employee engagement, and a guy came up to me during a break and said, "Oh, you've got to read this book, Glued to Games." This was fairly early on in Happy Brain Science, so around 2012, I believe. And I said, "Oh, thanks very much." But in my head, I was like, well, I'm really all about employee engagement and science of happiness and thriving at work now. So I'm going to take this Glued to Games book and put it down low on my reading list. And then I read roughly 1 gazillion books on employee happiness and engagement and was like, okay, if I read one more of those books right now, I might want to poke my eyes out. So what else can I read? And I scanned down my list and I'm like, oh yeah, this book recommendation has been sitting here for years, Glued to Games. Maybe it's time I finally read that. And I read it and my two worlds just went and combined into each other because a book that I thought was just about games turned out to be referencing so much of the self-determination theory that is at the heart of employee engagement and satisfaction at work. So, we human beings bring the same intrinsic needs. We need autonomy. We need relatedness. We need mastery, or as it's called in the original research, competence. And so for me, this world about what motivates us and what engages us combined from the corporate workshop side and the game and gamified side, it all combined when I read that book. So I absolutely adore Glued to Games by Rigby and Ryan. Again, it's looking at the deepest level. So you're not going to hear about points and bonuses and leaderboards. All that stuff is good and useful, and there are lots of great gamification frameworks that use that. But this is about, at the core, what's happening inside the player's brain that wants to keep them engaged. Love that book and love teaching people about it through workshops and any other way I can, really.
Fantastic. And in that same sense now of recommendations, this is one of the questions that most guests say is the most difficult one. And it's about, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh boy, it is such a hard question because there are so many great ones. Do you allow cheating? Can I mention 3 or is that too many?
You can try. Let's see.
I'll go. Two of them are well-known games, and they're just going to make me look cliche. But I'll just quickly mention StarCraft, and in particular StarCraft 2. I'm a real-time strategy player on video games. I absolutely adore that game. I know it's been around for many years, but I think it's a great, great game. Similar classic game for board games, Settlers of Catan, just super fun, great interactions among players. I'm assuming everyone knows about both those games. Maybe fewer people know about a game called Mini Metro, which is a really fun game where you are laying out subways and trying to get passengers where they need to go. That game happens to have been made by friends of mine who I worked with when I worked at a video game company in New Zealand for a year. But I'm not recommending it because the makers are friends of mine. I'm recommending it because it's a wonderful game, and it's a different game. It's a game that feels different as you play it. There's very little flash. There's very little points and that overt high stimulation that comes in a lot of games. It's almost more of a Zen type game. It's very good at getting you in flow, which I think all games do if they do it well. So I'm cheating and giving you 3, 2 very well-known and 1 maybe not quite as well-known games. I adore all of those games.
Absolutely. And talking about games and gamification and all these topics, what would you say is your superpower when using games or creating gamification?
I think of, I don't want to claim to have any superpowers, but I appreciate the very positive question. I do think if I have a gift in this world that I was meant to share with the world, it is an ability to understand science and understand the real business world and understand how to get that real business world to learn that real peer-reviewed science through a fun, playful, gamified approach. As I think more and more about who I am and what am I here to do and what can I do, maybe not better, but differently than anyone else with a unique approach. I think, I'm a big, giant nerd. I love the science. I love games. And I love using games to help people understand this amazing science of the brain and how we can really thrive at work.
Fantastic. That is a fantastic answer, a fantastic power as well, because we do need to build more bridges between science, application in the business, and of course, definitely in the middle we have games. Absolutely.
Exactly, Professor Game. Well put.
So, Scott, we're arriving to the end, but before we let you go, we would like to know if you have any final piece of advice. Then, of course, let us know where we can find you in the world of the internet. Any plug you wanna put us there as well. This is the right place to put it. And of course, then we'll say it's game over.
Thank you so much. Well, I will make a couple of offers to your listeners, if that's okay. One is my card game, Choose Happiness at Work, is quite expensive compared to your average card game. I believe in its value. It makes a difference in people's productivity at work, and it's designed for corporations, but therefore it has a price that shocks some people. So I will tell all of your listeners, if they want to check out Choose Happiness at Work, they can enter the code ChooseHappy30, no spaces, ChooseHappy30. I don't believe capitalization matters, but if in doubt, put it all lowercase, and that'll get people 30% off my expensive game, Choose Happiness at Work. I also briefly mentioned a book that I have coming out soon, All Work and Some Play, The Scientific Case for Playing Games at Work. That talks about how games are uniquely good at teaching uniquely human 21st century job skills. So with AI and automation, improving and taking over a lot of jobs. What are we human beings going to do? We're going to focus on uniquely human skills like collaboration, creativity, communication, and critical thinking. And this new book that's coming out sometime in 2020 explains how games are a wonderful teaching tool for that at work. The book is not out yet, but if people want to know when it comes out, give us feedback on early drafts, a couple of things. You can contact me through my site, happybrainscience.com, and get on our mailing list that way, and we'll be sure to let you know when that book comes out if people are interested in reading it. And, more than anything else, I just want to encourage everyone to keep playing, and if possible, lighten up a bit. I think, I'm preaching what I need here, but I'm not trying to get political at all with you, Professor Game, but at least in my country, and I think largely around the world, there's a lot of discord, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of divisions in the world. And I think we need to come together as a species and we need to lighten up. And games are a great way of bringing us together and getting us to lighten up. And yes, there are a lot of problems in the world, but there are also a lot of fun, great people who want to connect with each other despite any political or other differences. So let's play. Let's get together and play. And maybe we can just heal the world through play.
Let's do this. Let's go. So thank you very much, Scott. I know your time is super valuable, just like most of our guests, but I know investing this time in the Engagers is hopefully going to bring some great stuff to you as well, because your message will hopefully reach even further now.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Game. You are a wonderful force for gamification and using games for good in the world, and I'm honored to spend some time with you and your listeners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks again, Mr. Scott. But for now, and for today at least, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, especially for getting to the end if you're listening to this. And I would like to know if you want to know more, to have more interviews with incredible guests like Scott Crabtree, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started into our email list. That way we will be in contact and you will be the first to know of any opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know who it is and what will our next guest be talking about? Well, then you'll have to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.